All right. So picking back up in the saga that is Paul's life and what he was going through there in at the end of the third missionary journey, he comes back to where? Where does he come back to at the end of the third? Jerusalem. To Jerusalem. And then what happens to him in Jerusalem?
He gets found by the officials there.
Okay, he gets found by the officials, but how does that happen? How does that work out?
Well, like she said, they accused him of bringing somebody into the temple area that's only allowed Jews. Yeah, well, a Gentile into the temple area that's only Jews supposed to go in.
Right.
That's when he had the big riot.
Okay, so there's a huge riot as a result of that, and who is it that accuses him of bringing a Gentile into the holy place in the temple?
It was the Jews.
Specifically,
The Pharisees and the Sadducees.
specifically Jews from where? Do you remember that? What Jews? Was it Jews from Jerusalem that did it? Or what Jews in particular was it? I don't know if I emphasized this, but you might have picked it up in your reading. It'd be in your reading. They were Jews from Asia. Jews from Asia. So the people that seized him, it says Jews from Asia, saw Paul, seized him there at the temple. And then they start yelling, Jews, fellow Israelites, this guy's done this, and that's when the riot starts. So those Jews from Asia are probably from Ephesus, most likely, because that's the province of Asia. So they're probably from Ephesus, because they actually are calling Paul out for having Trophimus the Ephesian there. Now, how would they know that Trophimus the Ephesian is a Gentile? Well, probably because they're from Ephesus. Yeah, most likely. So it's this interesting exchange where you have Paul. He's doing this time of purification. He's trying to put people at ease who have accused him of rejecting the Jewish law, and he's doing this purification, and then he gets attacked. So then, what happens when he gets attacked? What happens to him? What happens at that point after the riot starts?
They're getting ready to beat him.
The what? The Romans.
He thought he was somebody that had started a riot.
Egyptian.
Egyptian thought he was an Egyptian rebel.
Exactly. Yeah. So there is a Roman military commander, a tribune. And that person's usually going to be in charge of around 1,000 soldiers. There's a little bit of disagreement depending on what type of cohort he was in charge of. But typically around 1,000 or so, maybe a little less. So that Roman commander runs, because there's this big fortress over the temple called the Antonia Fortress. He runs out and he rescues Paul. He takes a lot of soldiers. We're not sure how many soldiers he brings with him, but he's probably got around 200, because it says he brings multiple centurions with him, which tends to indicate, so a centurion will be over about 100 people. Right, so because there are about 100 people and he brings multiple centurions, those centurions are probably bringing their soldiers. So understand, when we see this, sometimes we just think of it as, that military commander just runs out by himself. No, he's probably got around 200 soldiers with him. Maybe more, maybe less, but it's a lot. It's not a small amount of soldiers that he has with him, not just him and a couple of guys. This is a very large riot right there in the outer courts of the temple, there on the Temple Mount. And this is a big deal because major disturbances have happened in the city at the temple. In fact, probably about, this is around, so about 7 years after this, there's going to be a major Jewish revolt. About 7 years after this. So this is an area, it's at a time where there's a lot of tension going on. 7 to 10 years after this, it's going to explode. So this is kind of a preliminary to that. Okay, so he gets arrested, and now that catches us back up, right? So he gets arrested, and when they bring him in, the Romans were about to beat him. They're about to beat him up. This is actually pretty common. Like nowadays, when we think of of interrogation. We don't think you're going to get interrogated and get beat up in interrogation. That's not how it's supposed to work. You look at the crime dramas and stuff. It happens in all of our crime dramas, and I'm sure it still happens in some places, but it's not supposed to happen. We actually have rules saying the police shouldn't beat someone up, even though sometimes those rules are broken. Now, Rome had no such rule. If you are not a Roman citizen, and we talked about that last week, what citizenship entails, right? If you are not a Roman citizen, they thought, like, the best way to get information out to you is just beat you up until you confess. Just beat you up until you tell us what we need to know.
Last week you explained how they became Roman citizens. It wasn't a matter of just being born there. What did you explain that again?
So let me go back into citizenship, because this is an important it's an important distinction to know how Roman citizenship worked at the time. How does citizenship in general work? So when we think of citizenship, we think of if you're born in the country, birthright citizenship, or two parents of that country. So if you've got American parents, or if you were born in America, automatically you're a citizen. The way citizenship tended to work in the ancient world was citizenship was a privilege. Citizenship was not something you automatically got simply by being born in a particular place. Citizenship was a privilege. Now, Roman citizenship in particular was a privilege. So there are certain things that came with Roman citizenship. They could not just beat you for no reason in order to get information out of you.
How did they get that privilege?
I'll get there. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me finish explaining kind of why it's significant. Recapping that real quick, and we'll talk about that again. So they can't just beat you for no reason. You can't be crucified. They have to treat you a little bit different. So it comes with these privileges and with these statuses being a Roman citizen. So how do you get that? There's a couple ways to get it. One way to get it is to be born to two Roman citizen parents. That's one way that you would get it. That's most likely how Paul got it, because Paul says, I was born a citizen. And it could be granted to you if you were a slave of a Roman citizen and they freed you, you automatically were given citizenship as a part of being freed. So that's one way. Another way that early on in the empire didn't happen a lot, but later on it was starting to happen more. Citizenship could be granted as a kind of a political favor, which means as the empire started to go along, certain emperors started granting citizenship for a price. If you give me some money, then I'll give you citizenship. Now we actually see that in the text we're talking about, right? We see the tribune ask. He finds out that Paul's a Roman citizen. He says, "Hey, how'd you become a citizen?" Paul's like,
take a bribe.
"Well," he's like, "How'd you become a citizen?" I think you're thinking of Felix.
Yeah, his parents were
I
born.
thought that's where you were.
No. Felix is the governor.
Yeah.
Later on, Felix is going to want a bribe.
Right.
And that's why Felix isn't going to let Paul go. So we're getting there. We've got to go through the trial before the Sanhedrin first. But yeah, that's fine. I'd rather y'all be like itching to go forward because you've read it, that's a good place to be. So yeah, where we're at now, he's still with the military commander. The military commander, he can't find out what's going on. He tries to find out what's going on. He stabilizes the situation, tries to find out what's going on. He finds out that Paul is not some crazy Egyptian, but he doesn't know he's a Roman citizen yet. So then he's going to let Paul speak to the crowd. Again, trying to speak with a mob is actually pretty common in the ancient world. It's a little unusual that he let Paul do the speaking, but again, the Roman tribune probably doesn't speak Aramaic, which was the Hebrew dialect, which was they probably spoke a Hebrew dialect of Aramaic. He wouldn't have spoken that. He spoke Greek. He's pretty clear that he speaks Greek there in Acts. So we have this speech. It doesn't work. Everything gets crazy. So they bring him inside and say, beat this guy up until he tells you why everyone is so mad at him. Then he finds out about his Roman citizenship, and now everything changes, right?
Yep.
You'll notice from here on out that Tribune tries to paint himself as a defender of a Roman citizen. I'm here to protect this I've got to protect this Roman citizen. So that interaction between those two, he says, how did you become a Roman citizen? Well, I was born a Roman citizen. How about you? I paid a great price. He paid a great price. That's how the Tribune became a Roman citizen. You actually find out that Tribune's name later. It's Claudius. I can't remember his last name. But you actually find out that Tribune's name later. He's going to write a letter to the governor, and you see that included in Acts. Okay, so he's arrested. You find out he's a Roman citizen. Now we've got to treat him differently. Again, not everybody's a Roman citizen. Rome, here's one of the struggles with citizenship. We tend to think of the Roman Empire like a country. We tend to think of it like a country. And you've got these individual cities in the country, but it's a country, right? It's not like that. Rome is a city. And there are certain rights that you have with being a part of that city. Now, Rome has conquered a lot of territory, and there's a lot of territory that reports to Rome, and they've chosen to give certain people within certain cities and certain areas within their empire citizenship, but ultimately, it's not a guarantee that you're going to get that. In fact, most people won't. The vast majority won't get it. Okay, so the first big speech, the first big defense that Paul gives is actually before the crowd. He's going to get up and he's going to give this big speech to the crowd. But then, the next day, he's going to actually have what kind of is a formal trial before the Sanhedrin. So think of yourself if you are the Tribune. You're in this situation as the Tribune, and you're like, oh, I don't know what to do with this guy. There's a mob that's trying to kill him. I saved him. I was about to beat him. I find out he's a Roman citizen. I need to make sure, I have to keep him, it's my responsibility to keep him safe now. I don't even know what to do. So who are the Jewish leaders? The Sanhedrin. So now, the Sanhedrin is the high court for the Jewish people in Jerusalem. These are the people that perpetrated the murder of Jesus. These are the people who pushed that forward. That trial, they had a trial by night, and then they presented Jesus before Pilate. That's what's going on here. So this is the same people. Now, 20-something years have passed. So let's get our time right. This is 20 to 30 years after Jesus. But it's the same body. A lot of the people probably aren't still alive or still in that court, but it's that same general group. So he's going to come, he's going to report before the Sanhedrin, and it's a very interesting encounter, right? What happens? I know I've got it written up here, but y'all should remember it too. What happens in that encounter before the Jewish leaders?
Well, they start attacking him, huh? Because, let's see, they accuse Paul of believing in the resurrection.
The Sadducees.
Yeah, and that's
Okay.
yeah.
So now the Pharisees believe in that, and they didn't believe.
Well, the Pharisees
believe
believe,
in
but
the
the Sadducees didn't.
Yeah, so now you
Right.
got a conflict.
Yeah, and so
So
yeah.
they start fighting.
Exactly. So this is one that can confuse us if we don't know the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees.
Right.
So Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole lot of other things. They don't believe in angels. They don't believe it. Basically, the only part of the Bible they believe in is the first 5 books. Exactly. That's the Sadducees. And then you have the Pharisees.
That believes in the resurrection.
They believe in the resurrection. They believe in angels. They believe in all these things. What group was Paul a part of?
He's a Pharisee.
He was a Pharisee. He had been a very successful Pharisee. So you look at the Sanhedrin, and it's actually made up of both groups. So what you see is actually really clever on Paul's part. They start to question him. He gets before him. He gives, comes before them. They start to question him, and then he realizes, hey, it's a divided group. It's the Pharisees and the Sadducees who very much disagree with each other, but they kind of come together in this loose allegiance, but they disagree. And what does he say? Do y'all remember what he says?
Why did you beat a Roman citizen before a trial or something? I don't know.
No, we're actually we're moving on a little further.
Okay, so I don't know.
That's what he says to the soldiers that try to beat him. Is it lawful for you to beat a Roman citizen without trial? But here he says, brothers, I'm a Pharisee, and the only reason that I'm here is because I believe in the resurrection. Now, that's absolutely true, isn't it? His issue is that he doesn't just believe in the resurrection in the general sense. He believes in the resurrection specifically as in Jesus was resurrected.
Right.
But what he says is, absolutely, he's like, look, brothers, I am being put on trial. I'm a Pharisee. I'm being put on trial because I believe in the promise of the resurrection. And he even is closer to home. Like he's saying, hey, if they let him go on talking, he'd probably tell you, and guess what? The resurrection's already, the foretaste of that resurrection is already here through Jesus. But, yeah, so what happens? He says, hey, there is, I'm only on trial because I believe in the resurrection, and what happens?
Isn't it, he goes on to say, of Jesus whom you killed?
Let's look at that.
So that's what I was thinking. I thought that's when he...
Let's look at that. Now, he gives several speeches in this. Let's look at that specific passage, this particular one. Now, he's going to go into a lot of depth.
Yeah, because I mean,
That's where it can be.
Someplace and I'm ahead of him.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's where it can be confusing because you're going to have several speeches, and they're all very similar.
Right.
So let's read this particular speech. This one is not as in depth as the other. So let's take a look here.
23.
It should be in 23, yeah. So it says, right, so we'll pick up at 28 of chapter 22, verse 28. That way we can kind of pull all the way into it, get the full context, okay? Chapter 22, starting in verse 28. It says, and then the commander answered, with a large sum I attained my citizenship. And Paul said, I was born a citizen. So that's what we just talked about. Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. And the next day, so now we're about to go into that. And then the next day, because he wanted to know for certain what he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all of their council, Sanhedrin, to appear, and brought Paul and set him before them. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him in the mouth. Okay? This is where it gets heated. And then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit in judgment according to the law. You sit to judge me according to the law, and yet you command me to be struck contrary to the law. And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? So again, he's in this high priestly role, even though he's not acting becoming of that high priestly. And then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, there's two ways to take that, by the way, and I don't want to get. Some scholars will point out how does Paul not know that he's a high priest? The high priest wears a certain garment that should be a dead giveaway that he's a high priest. Now, it is possible that Paul's being sarcastic here and saying his behavior is not indicating that he's a high priest. So his behavior is clearly not indicating that he's a high priest. So, and it may be that Jesus is my high priest too. But there's a good chance he's indicating sarcastically, well, you're not acting like a high priest, so how am I going to know? That is a distinct possibility here. So here's where it goes. So we actually don't get Paul going into his full speech yet. That's a little bit later. And that's what I thought, but I didn't. They're so close, I didn't want to say that and then find out that I was telling you wrong. So that's why I wanted to read it. Yeah, he goes into his speech more later. But here we go. And then when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried to the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope of the resurrection from the dead, I am being judged." Again, he, just like the rest of the Pharisees, hey, I believe in the hope of the resurrection. Now Paul would say that hope is already here. If they let him keep talking, which that's not going to happen. And when he had said this, a dissension arose among the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. And then there rose a loud cry, and the scribes and the Pharisees party rose and protested, saying, "We find no evil with this man, but if the spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." Now that actually is a theme. That was Gamaliel said that way back in the beginning of Acts, right? Let us not fight against God. And now, when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled into pieces by him, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him to the barracks. Whew, right? That's an intense thing. But it's really interesting what happens. Paul is a very intelligent person, not getting anywhere. Before he can even say anything, he gets popped in the mouth. And what does Paul? He says, "Some Pharisees, some Sadducees, I'm around my people. Y'all know why I'm being persecuted? Because I'm a Pharisee." And immediately all the Pharisees say, "Oh, I don't see any fault with it." Now, this happens in politics today, right? We say we ain't gonna name names, but this happens in politics today. If it really doesn't matter which party you're on. If your boy or gal, if the person that you're on for, maybe they do something, you close ranks, right? That happens, and it also can happen with family too, right? Hey, I know he's doing wrong, but you better not say nothing about it. That's my people. Yeah, so that kind of thing is happening. Once he declares himself a Pharisee and says, "They're only after me because of the resurrection," all of a sudden, all of these old kind of trends, these old kind of locked in ideologies and groups start to close ranks. And
But didn't they remember him? He was with him.
30 years have passed.
Yeah.
That there was a lot of old ones.
Right. So it's important to catch that. That a lot of time has passed. So her question was, wouldn't they know Paul? Well, that's the thing. Understand what all has happened for Paul. After Paul had his Damascus Road journey, it was maybe a decade or so before he really did anything after that. So we don't see first missionary journey until around 48 AD. Well, Jesus was probably crucified around the early 30s. Around the early 30s AD. Some will say late 20s, early 30s. So Paul probably is doing all of his ministry in the 30s or so. Now, imagine that he's probably doing his persecuting in the early 30s, early to mid 30s. That's where he's doing his persecuting. This is taking place in around 58 to 60 AD. So we got a good idea that this is around 58. Why? Because we know he ends up in Jerusalem around 60 AD, gets released around 62. So he's there around, he gets to Rome around 60 AD and gets released 62. So we know that he was held in Caesarea for 2 years. So that puts this around 57, 58, around 58 AD. So 25 to 30 years have passed. So understanding life expectancy is not as long back then as it is now. We have someone live to the 80s, and that's not totally unusual. Life expectancy is not quite as long. And then also, there's no guarantee that everybody would have known. And even if they had, it's been 30 years. So there's a good chance that most of the people that would have known him are at least not in that room anymore. Maybe some are, but there's a good chance that maybe they don't remember. Yeah. I think that's the struggle with Acts. In Acts, he covers so much. And it's not like with the Gospels, right? The Gospels are covering about 3 years. Jesus' ministry is around 3 years. Now, we get into John versus the Synoptic Gospels. You can kind of have some arguments about the exact length of time, but it's a couple years, a few years. Acts takes place over the course of around 30 years. And he doesn't tell you, by the way, time has passed. Here's some more time has passed. He doesn't tell you. You just kind of get that as you go. So looking at this, going further, the people who are against Paul and against what Paul's standing for now are going to take law into their own hands. So you have some vigilante justice going on now at this point. So you've got 40 men who are going to take a vow. Yeah.
Eat or drink.
No eating or drinking, right? Which means it's in their best interest to get that vow fulfilled as soon as they can, right? That's right. And they better get it done, otherwise they're going to get very grumpy very quick, right? They might not see it, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we got these 40 men and they make a vow. So understand how serious this is. This is not a vow just to beat him up a little bit. They want to murder him. This is 40 people, and think of how far this has come. This is 40 people who have made a vow before God that they're going to murder someone. Okay? Let that sink in.
Yeah.
And they think that it's service to God. Now, get this. The very person they're murdering, 30 years earlier, would have been one of those 40.
Yeah, he would have been.
30 years earlier, he would have been one of those 40.
Yeah.
Get that changed. The person who was the persecutor is now being persecuted by the same group of people. See that reversal.
That he was a part of.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. See that reversal. Let that sink in. Look, I think Luke really wants you to get this. So we see that, and he's going to get warned. Paul's nephew is going to find out about this. So this is actually pretty interesting, right? We don't have a lot of mention of Paul's family. We know from 1 Corinthians that Paul is not married, at least at the time that he wrote 1 Corinthians. Some speculate that he was never married. Some speculate that he was, but when he became a Christian, she left. We don't know. We're not 100% sure what it is. But Paul's nephew, so we know he's got a sibling, and his sibling has a kid.
Yeah, because when we studied the life of Paul, wasn't it in Philippi that he didn't have any family? Philippians, that he didn't have no family, and Epaphroditus had to take care of it?
No, so what you have in Philippians is typically you would have a situation when a person is in prison. Typically, their family would take care of them. We're not sure much about his family, which is ironically, that's what's happening here. He's in prison, and what's happening? His nephew is taking care of him.
So that's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
You know now that he has family.
Right. We know that he has family, but we don't really know how much. We don't know how close he is to him. And notice, Paul, actually, he's from Tarsus, but we know that he grew up in Jerusalem a lot. We actually know that from his speech. He grew up in Jerusalem a lot. So, his nephew's probably from that area. But in terms of family going out to him when he's doing his missionary journeys, no, you don't have any of that. You actually have the church being his family through Epaphras.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Here we actually see his family. This is the only indication that his family, any part of his family, has any contact with him. And it's pretty likely, since he's been in prison so much, and they haven't seemed to be taking much care of him, that he got lucky on this one because they're close by. But for the most part, his family doesn't seem to be engaged much. So his nephew's going to warn the Romans. So he's going to come, he's going to tell them, he's going to warn the Romans, and the tribune's going to take this pretty serious, right? What's the tribune going to do? He's going to move it, okay? Is he just going to say, here, take a couple, I'm going to get a couple soldiers to...
Oh, no, he had a whole bunch of them that
Check.
he
200 soldiers.
Yeah, it was how many?
200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen.
That's right, 470 troops of different. That's like fighting a battle. Like you got infantry, you got spearmen, and you got cavalry. He is ready for war, right? That's a lot. Now, the Greek word that's used for this to describe this tribune, this military commander, actually means a leader of 1,000. So this may mean 1,000. This may mean like he's basically sent half of his forces. Some actually speculate that he would have had a lot less. He would have had less than that. So he may have actually sent most of his forces. We're not really sure. But what we do see here is that he takes this accusation very serious. And notice when he writes that letter, when he writes the letter to the governor, when he writes a letter to the governor, he says, hey, there's this, you got a little bit of revisionist history going on here, right? He says, hey, the Jews were this mob was trying to kill this guy. I found out he was a citizen, so I saved him. You catch that?
Yeah.
You catch that? Because that is not how it happened, is it? No, he was ready. He found out that he was a citizen after. He was ready to beat him up like a common criminal. And then he finds out, oh, this is a citizen. Now he's reporting, hey, look at all I'm doing to try to protect the citizen of Rome. Look at me. I deserve an award, right? This is very much a political measure. But you actually kind of get a hint of who the tribune is, because he gives you his name in that. Yeah, Claudius, and then I can't remember his last name. Lysias? Yeah. Yeah, so you kind of get an idea of who he is, just a little bit more about him. So he sends him to the governor, and it's Felix at this point, right? So he sends him to Governor Felix. Now, we actually do have a lot of historical information about Felix. A little bit about Festus after him, but we have a good amount of historical information about Felix. Felix was known for being fairly corrupt. We actually see that in Acts, but you see that even more in the historical record where the guy named Josephus later writes about Felix. So Felix was fairly corrupt. He's eventually going to get removed from power, and Festus is going to be sent there. But if we look at this, he gets to Caesarea, and Felix is there responsible for dealing with him. So now he's going to have his second trial before Felix. And the result is going to be not what you expect. He's going to do this big, great speech. He's going to talk to him, and Felix thinks he can get some money out of him. And that's what you were talking about earlier. So Felix, he's going to leave Paul in prison there for 2 years. 2 years. Because he thought he could get some money from Paul's family, and he wanted to please the Jewish leaders. So again, we don't really know much about his family, but it seems like he's barking up the wrong tree with that, right? Trying to get money from Paul's family. But again, that wasn't necessarily uncommon. Our legal system, like we think of holding somebody for 2 years, we actually have specific laws that say you have a right to a speedy trial. And it doesn't seem like it always works that way. But we have laws. And actually, my wife worked at a law place for a while, and they were talking about, even though we have that right to a speedy trial, a lot of times the defense wants to kind of extend it out. So it's the person being tried that a lot of times tries to extend it out so they can get more evidence. But what they used to do a lot of times is they would just throw you in prison on some charge, and they would just hold you. They just hold you. I hold you as long as I want to hold you. And they could do that. That's why we do have that right to a speedy trial. Like if you desire it, you can usher things along. They can't just hold you without telling you what the charges are. They got to tell you. Here, we have this situation where he's trying to get money, and he's trying to please, this is political, he's trying to please the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders are angry at this Christian movement, want to crush this Christian movement. Paul's a Roman citizen, but they're using everything they can do in order to hinder Paul. Now, he does get treated well. He seems to be treated well. And even when he's in Jerusalem, he gets treated well, right? He gets treated well. They allow his nephew to come. He's able to send his nephew to go tell the tribune what's going on. So he is being treated well, but prison is prison. So prison is still prison. And probably what's happening is the church is providing for his needs. Well, possibly his family, again, we're not sure, but the church is most likely providing for his needs there in Caesarea. Because we already know he's already on his way. He spent time with Christians in Caesarea, in that area. All right, so now we're going to see a totally new direction. So Felix is going to get replaced by Festus, another governor. Gotta love that name, right? He's going to get replaced. And then Festus wants to move the trial to Jerusalem to please the Jews. Now get this. Get what's at stake here. Last time Paul was in Jerusalem, what did the Jews try to do to him? They tried to kill him. So again, you've got to look at this in light of the political arena of the time, that this Roman governor comes in. He wants to please the Jews. He wants to smooth things over politically. And Paul is a pawn. Paul's a pawn. I can basically move him there, and I can make them happy and put his life, even though it's putting Paul's life at risk, I can do that and make them happy. It's a political thing. So he wants to move him. But then Paul's going to pull the trump card. I've been waiting for 2 years for a fair trial. I'm willing to speak the truth of what Christ did to anybody, but I'm tired of it. It's kind of the feeling you get when you read it. It's like, I'm done. And then he appeals to Caesar. Now, this is one of those privileges. We talked about those Roman citizenship privileges. Some of the privileges are, they can't just beat you without a trial, and they can't crucify you, which is considered like the most horrendous way to die. So they can't do that. Another thing is, when it comes to capital cases, meaning death is on the line, as a Roman citizen, at any point you can appeal to Caesar. Caesar is the emperor. Now get this. This would be like you having the ability at any point, if you felt like you weren't being taken care of, at any point being able to say, I appeal to the president. Or really in our legal system, I appeal to the Supreme Court. Because we separate our judiciary and our executive. They didn't do that. So I appeal to the Supreme Court. I want to take it to the top right now. And that was a right you had as a citizen. Now, again, they could do this because not everybody's a citizen. Citizen is a much more limited group, much more privileged, limited group here. So once he did that, that really, in a lot of ways, it really hide Festus's hands. You can't send me to Jerusalem and do all this. I appeal to Caesar. Like, I'm done. I'm done with this. I appeal to Caesar. So, when you look at this, this is a major move in a transition that we can miss a lot. All right, so, I had a whole slide talking about everything I just said. I don't know why. Well, there you go. So, there it is. You've got it on your paperwork. But then it kind of what we see there is, where's Caesar at? Caesar's in Rome, right? Caesar's got a busy schedule. He's in Rome. He maybe moves around, but his base is in Rome. So that's going to move us. That's going to start to move the action towards Rome, which is what? What do we say? That's where it's going to end. And the ends of the earth, really, if you get it to Rome, it's going to the ends of the earth. That's the idea. It's very much the center of their kind of world and universe there. So, looking at this, you would expect it to go on, right?
Mm-mm.
Take him. That's what you expect. You expect him to move on. But then you have this interesting third trial. It's a third trial, and it's really going to be his third big speech. Because he had that speech before the crowd. He didn't really get much of a speech on that first trial, and then he gets the speech before Felix, and then now Agrippa. So, Herod, because we just love bringing up Herod, right? All about Herod. So, let me tell you. So we've got Herod. Just a real rundown here. You've got Herod the Great, which is the Herod that was the king over Israel in the time that Jesus was born, right? Herod the Great is the one that does the killing of the infants in Bethlehem, okay? Herod the Great dies. He has multiple sons. His kingdom gets split up. One of those sons is Archelaus, who doesn't stay. He's the one that's why Joseph did not want to go back to Jerusalem to live there. So he goes on up to Galilee. Who's in charge of Galilee? Herod Antipas, exactly. Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is there in Galilee, and Herod Antipas is the one that orders the execution of John the Baptist. Herod's in charge of Galilee and Perea, which is close to where John the Baptist's ministry was. He's in charge there. Herod Antipas, again, I'm not going to quiz you on the Herods, but it's helpful for you to know the differences. Okay? Herod's the one that's going to kill John the Baptist, and Herod Antipas is going to be the one that kills John the Baptist, and he's going to be the one that is present at Jesus' trial. He's present in Jerusalem, and he actually has a little mini trial there of Jesus, as it talks about in Luke. So then we get to Herod Agrippa the First. Not this guy. Herod Agrippa the First is the one that orders the execution of James, the brother of John, and was going to execute Peter, but God saved him. And then he dies very publicly. Very much of a wrath of God moment there earlier on in Acts. So now, because we haven't had enough of the Herod family yet, we get Herod Agrippa the Second. That's Herod Agrippa the First son. Very original name. Very original name. But this guy, he's not actually the king in Jerusalem or Judea or anything like that. He's the ruler of a small area that is actually kind of north of the Sea of Galilee. So he's a ruler of a small area there, but he's also, because the Romans don't want to get embroiled in a bunch of religious things, he's also kind of, in a way, he's a ruler over the temple area. Now, the high priest really kind of handle things there, but he does have ultimate authority over the, underneath the emperor, ultimate authority over the temple. So his kingdom, he doesn't have near about as much power as his father once had, but he's known as a distinguished guest and an expert in the Jewish law. So now you have this situation where here Festus is. You've got this demand to go before Caesar. Festus was really just using Paul as kind of a political pawn. He's kind of like, I could have probably released him had he not done that, which yeah, but you were about to send him to Jerusalem. So don't try to play too nice, Festus. But yeah, so he says, hey, I want Herod Agrippa to hear the trial, to hear him talk. So then Paul gives his case, and he gives his case to this expert of the Jewish law, but the result is ultimately he doesn't really have any power to do anything, or he won't exercise that power. To be honest, they could have at any point probably just let him go if they wanted to. So the result is he still goes to Rome. So now we have this nice long trip to Rome.
But they couldn't let him go because he had already asked to see Caesar.
Yeah, see, that's an interesting thing. Festus, all these names, Festus really makes this big deal about, he's requested to go to Caesar, so I have to send him to Caesar.
Right.
At the same time, I just want to say politically, in practical terms, yes, he's appealed to Caesar, but I would be hard pressed to think that you can't just let him go. He says that, he makes that out, but that really smacks of an excuse. To be totally honest, it really smacks of an excuse. Oh, I would have let him go, but I have to now because he appeals to Caesar. Yeah, you say that after you are about to send him to Jerusalem. And you say that to the king who you're trying to impress. You know? So I would just take Festus's words for a grain of salt here. Because the whole point of the appeal to Caesar is, I'm not getting fair judgment. So send me to Caesar because I know as a Roman citizen I'll get fair judgment there. But now if he wants to turn around and give him fair judgment, I think he could allow that. Again, when we're dealing with descriptive literature, it's describing. So just because Festus says that doesn't mean, and he says it in a context of trying to impress this other politically important leader. I would have let him go. But now I'm just so powerless. Yeah, you're powerless. Yeah. You were about to send him to Jerusalem where he was almost certainly going to get killed. Sure, you're powerless, Festus. Sure. So Paul used the only tool he had to ensure that his mission continued to go towards Rome. Because he knew if we look at his letters and we look at him, his intent was always to go to Rome. He wanted to go to Rome. So we see, ultimately, he says, I appeal to Caesar. And that's going to continue his mission to Rome back forward. So he gives 4 speeches, but really, one of them you can barely count. So he's got a speech before the mob, a speech before the Sanhedrin, and a speech before Felix, and a speech before Herod Agrippa II. Now, the speech before the Sanhedrin, again, it's basically, it's very much like, why'd you just hit me? And, hey, I'm a Pharisee, and this is why I'm being. But as far as full form speeches, he's got 3 of those. But he's got 4 speeches total, but 3 full form speeches. So the trip. Before we do the saga that is that trip, let's take a 5-minute break to catch your breath, and then we'll run through this trip. There's only a few more slides here, but we could kind of get bogged down here. So let's go ahead and just take a little break. So now that we're back, it's the trip to Rome. So we had our initial. How did we get here? We have that appeal to Caesar. So now, how are we going to get to Rome? So
it was rocky.
It's rough, isn't it? It's rough. Our action adventure, Paul. Yeah. So here goes. So it's a difficult trip. As they're going to go, they're going to get blown off course. In a storm. You're going to see shipwrecks off the coast of the island of Malta. And then on Malta, the people are going to start worshiping him because he's going to get bitten by a snake.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So So we have this interesting story as we look. First off, when you're going, a lot of these trips are going to be via ship. So they're going to take you at least a certain way, maybe on foot, but the soldiers are escorting him. And as these soldiers are escorting him, they're going to get him on a ship, and they seem to be booking passage on these grain ships in some cases. And notice this is going to be, these are not small ships, these are very large ships. I think sometimes when we read these stories, we think we're talking about little dinghies, like little small. These ships were 100 to 200 feet long. These are large ships for the time because of the things that they're carrying. And as they're going, one of the first things they're going to do, they're going to get here to the island of Crete. What letter was written to a person on the island of Crete somewhere in Paul's ministry? Come on, we did this last time. Last term.
Was the Onesimus?
No, there's a particular associate of Paul that's doing ministry on Crete.
Oh,
Titus.
yeah.
There you go.
Second one, yeah.
Titus. Yeah, so they're going to get to Crete, and you're going to have this interesting, they're going to stop at a certain place. It's not going, they're on Crete on the ship. It's not going to be a great place to have a harbor. And then what are they going to do? They're going to disobey Paul. What you're going to see throughout this whole thing is Paul gives a lot of nice advice that no one follows.
Don't leave.
So don't leave. But what's going to happen is they're going to go out and notice. And one important thing to do. I have a map on here. I should have put a map on there. Sorry. But one thing as they're in Crete is actually they're at this one city and they're just going to go a little bit around the shore in order to get to the next place on the island of Crete that will be a better place to spend in the winter. You have to understand about ship traveling in this period. You do not want to spend a lot of time. You don't want to spend a lot of time traveling during the winter. The seas are very choppy. It's very difficult. You could, get shipwrecked. So what you have happening is you have them here. They're going to come around, and then all of a sudden this huge wind is going to come.
Said it was like a
Yeah.
northeaster.
Like a nor'easter. Yeah. It is like these are like hurricane force. These are huge.
Start throwing stuff over.
Exactly. It's going to
They
blow them.
almost left.
It's going to blow them way off course. It's going to throw them way off course. They're going to go way out of the way. Understand, they were actually only doing a little jump. Only a little jump. I mean, it might be something like going via boat. I'd have to kind of look at a map, but it might be something like going from Mobile to New Orleans or Slidell on a ship. That's just a little. On a car, it takes 2 hours, but on a ship, that's not that far.
The cord takes 4 hours, Ben.
Well, I've lived in New Orleans, so it doesn't take as long for me. It doesn't take as long for me.
You know, actually, it's fun for me.
Yeah, that's right, Kenneth.
So, and y'all have to account for traffic. I live on the other side of the traffic in New Orleans. So they're going to end up going, and then Paul is going to have the Lord's talking to Paul. And it's very interesting because Paul's kind of got this stoic feel, like what you said before we started the video. Matt, you said, man, it's inevitable at this point. God says, I'm taking you to Rome. Nothing's going to stop it. I'm taking Paul to Rome. Yeah, he's kind of got this. He's got this look, telling the Roman commander, like the Roman leader, centurion, look, I'm going to tell you what to do. God's going to save everybody, but you need to listen to me.
You just gotta listen.
Right, you're going to stay, but you need to listen.
You're gonna make it.
But it gets so crazy, they start to get scared. So it's nighttime, right? And they're just drifting. Imagine it, it's just drifting. And the way that they find out the depths is they have these ropes that they kick out. And it's how many knots that lets you know how many fathoms deep it is. And they do a check. Oh, we're getting closer. Do a check. We're getting closer. And they're terrified of running aground, right? Having this big wreck and them all being drowned. So, what do these soldiers do? They totally lose discipline, and they're about to try to escape, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the other side of the ship.
Yeah.
Again, that doesn't make sense if you think this is a little dinghy. No, this is a big ship. So they're able to kind of get on the other side of the ship and start to kind of abandon ship. And then Paul is like, look, if you let them do that, we're all going to die. At this point, they've started listening to Paul. So they listen to Paul, and after all of this, they shipwreck everything. They managed to get onto dry land of Malta, right? And now here they are on Malta, and they come to shore. The people of Malta, the natives there, see them. They come up. Paul starts to get some firewood together, and what happens? He gets bitten by a snake.
And the snake hangs on to his
And he hangs on to it.
They're waiting for him to die.
And he just shakes it off, right? Now, what was the reaction of the natives?
Oh, they would just.
They said
Get
that,
ready to
they said
die.
that he was a criminal and he had escaped the death of the sea, but now that snake is gonna get him, he's gonna die now.
Exactly. That's significant. See, again, that's something I think we read over really easily. We read over this idea that as soon as they see him, they say, well, the gods must be angry. The gods must hate. What? We're not as superstitious as a society as they were. Now, there's still plenty of superstition, but we're not as superstitious. They have this idea of what you were saying, Ms. Nelda. They very much have this idea of, look, the gods were punishing you with that shipwreck, and you survived it, and the gods are saying, nope, I'm going to get you with a snake bite. Because that snake that bit you, there's no way you're not going to die. I'm going to get you with a snake bite. Yeah, in their mind, like, the gods hate this guy. I mean, that's it.
Yeah.
But nothing happens. Yeah, nothing happens. He survives. So then they immediately think what?
He's a murderer.
Well, they thought he was a murderer, but now they think he's a god, right?
Yeah.
So he went from he's a murderer because the gods are really trying to get you to, oh my goodness, you must be a god because you should have died.
Yeah, there's no way you can live with that snake bite.
Right. So again, it's not that unusual for Paul, I guess, to be yeah. It's you're reading down, you're like, where? No, I see they think he's a murderer. Oh, okay. Yeah. It's a cliffhanger, right?
Yeah.
That's what it gets you. Yeah. It's interesting because is this the only time that someone has thought, natives of a particular area have seen a miracle and thought that Paul was a god?
Yeah, because Hermes, he thought it was
Yeah, they thought he was Hermes, right?
Yeah.
We see him there in Asia Minor, and they're thinking the same thing. So again, we see the power of God manifest through a man, through Paul. And then Paul having to clarify and say, no, this is not, I'm not a God, but let me tell you about who God truly is. So you see people not quite grasping, how do I deal with the manifesting of God's power? And they want to attribute it to a pagan God, but he has to clarify, no, let me tell you who really did this. So after this, now we get to make it to Rome, finally. They're going to manage to work everything out. They're going to get back on the ships, and they're going to make it to Rome. So, something interesting. They were greeted by Christians. The gospel's already in Rome. How can he be greeted by Christians on the road? Christians from Rome meet him on the road, like where he's almost there. That can only be the case if there are already Christians in Rome. Now, we actually know from the epistles there are already Christians in Rome too, right? Because the book of Romans, he says, hey, I hope to come to you. I've never been there before. So he's clearly writing to Christians in Rome, and he's never been there before. So just understanding that context. Again, sometimes we think of Paul, who is someone who God really used in an amazing way. But sometimes we think of everything about Paul as if he's the star of the show, and then we forget that God worked amazingly through Paul, but he also worked through other people. He also worked through other people. Just like God may work through a particular pastor or minister, but God's working through all of his people, not a particular person. No matter how significant that person's ministry is, God's the one that's significant, and God's the one that's working through. So, Paul's ministry is extremely important. But you see all of these other people that the Holy Spirit is using around that ministry as well. So at this point, Paul has gone through the ringer, right? And what is he going to be met with as soon as he gets outside of Rome? His brothers and sisters in Christ, other people whose lives God's worked in, they're going to meet him there. They're going to meet him outside of Rome. So where did the Christians in Rome come from? We're not sure, but I will note at the very beginning, at the day of Pentecost, it named all the different types of people that were there at Peter's sermon. So the first Christians in Rome very well may have been people that were there at Peter's sermon that went back home. So that's a high likelihood. We're not 100% sure, but that is a high likelihood here. So they're going to gather together. The Jews in Rome are going to gather together, and then Paul's going to teach them about Jesus. So you're going to have this time there where he brings them together, and he's got this final opportunity to teach them. So I want to read that there in Acts. Okay, so it's in 28. Okay, so let me just read about his arrival, starting in verse 17, 28:17. So we're going to read about his whole arrival there. So, and it came to pass after 3 days that Paul called the leaders of the Jews together. So when they had come together, he said to them, "Men and brethren, though I have done nothing against our people, or the custom of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans, who, when they had examined me, wanted to let me go, because there was no cause for putting me to death. But when the Jews spoke against it, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had anything of which to accuse my nation. For this reason, therefore, I have called you to see and speak with you, because for the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain." Again, for the hope of Israel, right? Who does he talk to first when he gets there? The Jews. I mean, outside of fellow Christians. The Jews, right? He still cares about his people. He wants them to come to the true Messiah, Jesus. The hope of Israel. So then they said to him, "We neither receive letters from Judea concerning you, nor have any of the brethren who came reported or spoken any evil of you. But we desire to hear from you what you think. For concerning this sect," that's Christianity. Again, we think of it as a separate religion, but at this point it really wasn't. It's a sect within Judaism, ancient Judaism. "For concerning this sect, we know that it is spoken against everywhere. So when they had appointed him a day, many came to him at his lodging, to whom he explained and solemnly testified of the kingdom of God, persuading them concerning Jesus from both the law of Moses and the prophets, and from morning till evening. And some were persuaded by the things that were spoken, and some disbelieved. So when they did not agree among themselves, they departed after Paul had said one word. The Holy Spirit spoke. The Holy Spirit spoke rightly through Isaiah, the prophet of our fathers, saying, Go to this people and say, Hearing you will hear, and you shall not understand, and seeing you will see, and you will not perceive. For the hearts of the people have grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, their eyes they closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. Therefore, let it be known to you that the salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will hear it. And when he had said these words, the Jews departed and had a great dispute among themselves. And then Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own rented house and received all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching the things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ with all confidence, and no one forbidding him. So you see, again, notice that we've kind of had this theme through the end, to the ends of the earth, right? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Now we get to the end, we get to the ends of the earth, and the first group of non-believers that he speaks to, he follows the same pattern with every city he goes to. He goes to the Jews first. And then the Jews, there's this disagreement. Some believe, some don't believe. And then he quotes Isaiah, but who else quoted that passage? Somebody else quoted that passage in the New Testament. Jesus. When they ask him why he speaks in parables, Jesus quoted the same passage. So seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear. Basically, some people are so, they've been hardened and they won't see it. They won't see it. We can get all kinds of theological debates about the exact meaning of that, but that's not the purpose today. The point is that there's a hardening among the people, and even when they have the truth of the gospel right in front of them, they won't accept it. At least a significant portion won't accept it. Some do, and some don't. And he says, just to know, this invitation has also been extended to the Gentiles. So you end this very beautiful, very powerful scene with, here I am in Rome. I'm offering it to you. Some of you will believe, some of you won't, but understand, now it's going to the nations. Because Gentile just means the nations. That's who the Gentiles are. They're the nations. This message is extended to the nations, and they will accept. And that's a hard, that's why there's a dispute among them. That's a hard message. You Jews, the chosen people, this message is going out to the Gentiles, and they're accepting it. They're accepting your Messiah. But again, Paul is not rejecting his people. He desperately wants, and we get that from Romans, he desperately wants his people to know, the Israelites to know Jesus. But at the end of the day, a large portion, not all, but a large portion of the Jews aren't going to accept. And he's letting them know, hey, the Jews are. It's open to the Jews. The Gentiles are. It's open to the Gentiles as well. And then we see this ending here. He's
So in that verse 29 where you read and you said the Jews departed, was that those that was non-believers, or they just?
Well, it seems it's interesting that he does that, right? He says some believed and some didn't believe, and then he says this last kind of mic drop moment, right? He says some believed, some didn't believe, and then after he says this word, he quotes Isaiah and says, "God's given this to the Gentiles, too." That's when they depart. It seems like, don't know for certain, it seems like both depart. those that believed and those that didn't believe, and that's where the disputing among them is happening. Because if they all disagreed with Paul, it doesn't seem like there'd be any disputing, right? But it says, then they departed, and there was a great dispute among themselves. So it seems like some of the Jews maybe accepted what he was saying, where others didn't. Not necessarily accepted to the point of they've now become Christian, but they're like, okay, I'm seeing what he's saying, and others are like, no, and then there's a dispute among them. Did some of these people become Christians? Oh, almost certainly. Some of them did. But you still see this. It's a tragedy. Really, you should get to the end of Acts. You should see the deep tragedy here. God's Messiah, the one that has been prophesied since the beginning, all the way back in Genesis 3, since the fall, the heel bruise his head, all the way back, God's Messiah, the Messiah who is through the line of David, the Jewish Messiah, he gets here, and everywhere his messengers go to tell his people about him, they refuse to accept. Seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear. That's the thing. And again, we don't really have time to kind of get into that, the context of that Isaiah passage and what God's doing there and how it's being used here. But we really see a deep tragedy here. There's a sense of judgment here. Oh, Israel, how I wanted to gather you together. We see in Jesus' ministry how he does that. Yet you're the city that kills your prophets. It's a continuation of this rejection. But it's not, again, this is not like a situation where God has totally rejected Israel either. Paul says, I wish that they would come. I'm a Jew. That's what Paul says in Romans 9 through 11. Paul's like, I'm a Jew. Like, I want them to come. But there's this hardening of the people, and they won't accept. Now, what we tend to think of hardening, what some people will do with this passage is they'll say, see, God is intentionally hardening and keeping them. I'll just note this on that. Yes, is God doing some hardening? Yeah, but who hardened themselves first? They hardened themselves first. God is taking that hardening, and even in Isaiah, what's the context of that? They're already disobeying God. That's where that's happening. He's saying, look, these people have turned their back on me. They're doing this, and I'm cementing that. See, hearing they will not hear, seeing they won't see. Like, they're not going to accept. There's a hardening taking place here. So it's really, in some sense, it's like one part judgment, but also it shows this continuing desire of God hasn't totally abandoned the people of Israel, but they've become so hard. You see that, you really see a tragedy in a lot of ways. They walk away disputing among themselves. But here Paul is, he continues for 2 years, and he continues to proclaim the kingdom of God while his people walk away disputing among themselves rather than accepting that kingdom. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy here. Now, what happens to Paul after? That's the real kind of a question to kind of button up as we end here. We see Paul. We see Paul there. We see he's going to. Yeah, he's going to be there in 2 years in Rome. So what happens to Paul? So the question that a lot of people have is, man, why does the book end at 2? Why does it end without telling you what happens to Paul? So there's a couple arguments. Some will say that it ends because Luke is not, because Paul's still alive. This is written 2 years after Paul's imprisonment. Paul just got released. Luke just leaves it there because he doesn't know how it ends. Some say that. That's one strong argument for saying that Luke is pretty early. It's written in 62 AD. Paul's still alive. There's another possibility, and a lot of people have really emphasized this possibility because of how the book ends. So, one other possibility is that Paul is already dead. It's written after Paul's death. It's written 70s, 80s AD, written after Paul's death. But Luke is trying to make the point that it's not about Paul, it's about the gospel. It's about the good news of the kingdom of God. And he doesn't need to follow Paul anymore because he's got Paul where he wants him. And the reason a lot of scholars will say that that's most likely it, because it's not about Paul, he doesn't end it with Paul's death, because Acts ends with a Greek word meaning unhindered. That's the last word in Acts, unhindered. Now, in English, we wouldn't think anything of that, but actually in Greek, you can arrange the words in almost any order. So what you see is at the end, it ends with unhindered. And it's important because it showed that the gospel, the news of the kingdom of God, that same news that Jesus was preaching, right, is going to continue to move to the ends of the earth unhindered. So what do we have? That initial command at the very beginning is, go Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth, and then it ends, I'm in Rome, and that message is going to be proclaimed unhindered. So, what a lot of scholars would say is the reason it ends here is not necessarily because Paul has died. Now, there's plenty of scholars that say that's why. But there's increasingly now a lot are saying he intentionally ends there because he's making this point. There Paul is. He's made it to Rome, and now from that point on, it's going to go unhindered.
Somebody else is going to pick up the mantle.
Yeah, where if you end it with Paul's death, and the Bible's argument, if you end it with Paul's death, it's almost like a defeat.
Yeah.
It's almost like a defeat, but it's intentional. What people with this particular view would say is this is intentional because he wants you to know that the gospel doesn't stop with Paul. And if you did it at his death, it would kind of get that idea. It's like no, it keeps going. It goes unhindered. God got Paul to Rome. He preached it in the very center of the empire to where once it makes it to Rome, all roads lead to Rome and all roads come from Rome in a sense. And guess what? The gospel's going to go out unhindered. Again, as far as dating, there's still a lot of debate about how you would date Luke. But even if this was written before, even if you did say this was written at the time of Paul, before Paul died, I think Luke is still making the point that the gospel goes out unhindered. The fact that he ends with that is a big deal. So what actually happens to Paul after Acts? So real quick about that after Acts. All we know is from tradition, because the Bible doesn't tell us at that point what happened. So after his house arrest, so he's in house arrest there. He's got a rented house, so he's comfortable for those 2 years, but it's still house arrest. You notice everybody's coming to him, right? He's not going to people. So he's on house arrest. This is what tradition says. He was found innocent by Caesar. He went on other missionary journeys, but then he was rearrested by the Romans and executed. So we got about maybe 4 to 6 years where he's doing other journeys, and then he gets rearrested and he gets executed. So that other 4 to 6 years is where you would get 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus. That's where you get those last pastoral letters. So what happens to Peter? Tradition is for Peter is that he was arrested and executed in Rome around the same time as Paul. Yeah. And then Emperor Nero persecuted the Christians in the 60s AD. So what you have happen is when Paul first goes to Rome, honestly, they're not really, it's just now starting to be a distinction between the the Jews and the Christians. Early on, it's not really clear to people that they're two separate sects. And you actually get to that point with Gallio. They're back in Acts around 18. You see Gallio says, I'm not going to rule on this thing. It's in Corinth. He's the proconsul of Corinth. He said, I'm not going to rule on this because this is an internal Jewish matter, right? What is a big thing with Festus and Felix? They're saying, look, this seems to be a Jewish matter. So, again, they didn't really understand the differences between Judaism and Christianity. By the 60s, you start to see, they start to become a little more clear that they're separate. It starts to be a little more clear. Well, what happens, Christians were not really on the outs in the early 60s. It wasn't really quite clear what they were. They're continuing to expand. By the late 60s, you have this, they're becoming a more dominant group, a more significant group where people are starting to know who they are a little bit more, but they're very mysterious. They don't know a lot of details about them. So when you have a group that's becoming numerous, but you don't know a lot about them, all these rumors start about them. Rumors like they do incest because they call everybody brother and sister. Rumors like they actually eat human flesh and drink human blood at their rituals. Those kind of rumors. So, now we actually hear about those from a later source, but those are the types of things that get circulated about them. So, when you get to the latter part of Nero's reign, Nero starts to go a little bit crazy. Earlier on in Nero's reign, he's actually got several teachers that really help him out. So early on, Nero's not as kind of wild and crazy. By the later part, some of those die or are executed, and Nero kind of just is on his own. And he starts to really kind of go crazy. There's actually a fire in Rome. Nero probably didn't do it, but people started suspecting that he did. So one of the things that he did in order to kind of move suspicion is he said he accused the Christians of doing it. So you have a mass persecution of Christians around the city of Rome, in and around the city of Rome. And Peter and Paul seem to get caught up in that and get executed at that time. And this is where you get some of that thrown to the lions, burned on stakes, crucified.
That's why he went crazy, because he did some awful stuff.
Well, he started going crazy way before that. He killed his own mother.
Now he's suffering from it.
So you really see this kind of deviation there. So the tradition, which I think is reliable, it's not that late of a tradition. What we get from that is Paul's head was cut off. Can't crucify a Roman citizen. Paul's head was cut off, and you get Peter being crucified. Now, it actually says he was crucified upside down. Now, was it actually upside down? We don't know. The source says that it was upside down. So that's what we have. And we're going to stop there. We're not going to go on to the next set of PowerPoints because we're all worn out.
Upside down, was it on his request or?
That is what the tradition says.
That it was to die like Christ.
Right.
Right. Yeah, that it was upon his request. That's what the tradition says. So yeah, any questions as we're finishing up this? We're going to go into the general epistles next week. We'll go into the general epistles, and then after that, later church history. But next week will pretty much be focused on the general epistles and what's happening in the churches, because the general epistles will give you a really good idea of what's happening in the churches, what the individual churches are struggling with around this period, both mainly after Acts.
So we need to read all of them?
Hebrews, James.
What do I say in the syllabus? Do I say anything? Do I have
I
that?
just looked at it.
You guys have general epistles and
Johannine? Yeah, Johannine. So what I would
textbook 747 and 82.
if you have time, read that text. That's going to be your best bet, is to read as many of the general epistles as you can. Understand, we're doing a lot of this, so if I had you read all of it, it would just be too much for one class period. Ideally, I would love for us to go through the general epistles like over an entire term. Unfortunately, that's just not how this class is set up. We're only going to have a short period of time, like 2 hours to go over the general. So read as many of those as you can, and we'll go through those. So any questions about this before we close for the day? All right. Well, I hope y'all have a good week, and I will see y'all next week.